The good news according to St. Mark, the first chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching? With authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. The good news of the Lord. For a moment with your prayers, I want to talk about sacrificing sacred cows. Sacrificing sacred cows. Some of y'all wondered, okay, where in the world is he going this time? And I will also say, I don't know if so much with this service. I know I definitely have to warn the tomorrow morning service, but you might want to lift your feet up because I may be stepping on some toes today. Tomorrow, as Don has already said, is Super Bowl Sunday. Big game going on. A lot of people going to be watching it. I'm going to be watching it for the commercials, but it will be on, and people will be watching. One of the objectives of football is to knock the other guy down. But tripping is not allowed. Let me explain it so those of you who don't really follow football, let me explain it to you. If the Patriots' Brian Stork is blocking the Seahawks' Michael Bennett, trying to prevent him from sacking Tom Brady, Stork isn't allowed to stick out his leg, and trip him. If he does and the referee sees it, he will be assessed a 10-yard penalty. That's because shortly after American football became popular, regulators realized that tripping others isn't very nice. If tripping isn't allowed in football, a game where people are supposed to be knocking each other down, it certainly should not be allowed in church, a place where people should be helping and holding each other up. Some of you are probably thinking, what in the world are you talking about, Daryl? I don't see anyone tripping people in church. Well, I know there was that one time a lady tripped over my leg in the foyer, but I didn't do it on purpose. I'm not talking about physically tripping people, but rather about spiritually tripping another person, or as Paul puts it, being a stumbling block to another believer. We heard it in that first reading. Paul's talking about a specific problem among the believers in Corinth, but it helps us deal with some issues that are important for us and this church. The issue in Corinth, which Paul addresses, centers on food sacrificed to idols. Each city at that time had 2 to 3 primary Greek gods. In Corinth, these included Aphrodite, the goddess of love, I can never get his name right, Asclepius, the god of medicine and healing, and his father Apollo, the god of music and the sun. Most people forget that Apollo is not just the sun god, he's also the god of music. Offering sacrifices to these gods was a vital part of the culture of Paul's day. Go to one of their temples and give the best part of meat to the priest for sacrifice to the god. Part of offering would be burned at the altar. But since these stone and wood depictions couldn't eat, the priests would eat whatever they wanted from the rest. What was left over was then sold in the market. So the Corinthian church was faced with a dilemma. Should you buy meat in the market that's been offered to idols? And should you accept the invitation to a dinner where meat dedicated to an idol would be served? Some of the believers didn't have a problem buying T-bones and pork chops at the local market for a family cookout. As far as they were concerned, it was just meat. Others, on the other hand, couldn't help but feel that they were sinning against God. Paul assured the believer that their liberty in Christ extended to lamb and pork chops and T-bones and any other food. Eating or not eating certain foods didn't bring God closer or move God farther away. Paul's caution to them was to be sensitive to what their actions did to other people. Remember, most of the early believers were Jewish, so they'd been raised on quite a few dietary prohibitions. Paul says there's nothing wrong with food that's been offered to idols, but not everyone understands this. Some people are so new to the way of Jesus Christ that when they eat food sacrificed to an idol, they see it as defiled meat. Paul says it's because their conscience is weak. Now, today, if he was to say that, we might say, oh, snap, he just called them weak. He didn't mean it like that. He was talking more about them being new to the faith and not mature spiritually. Paul lets the believers in Corinth know that's all right. We're no worse if we don't eat it, and no better if we do. A believer's spiritual health or vitality doesn't depend on whether or not they choose to eat food that's been given to an idol. That's not the problem. The problem is tripping up another believer. Now, I know that today we don't have to worry about eating food sacrificed to idols. The FDA wouldn't allow it. Even eating halal meat at a Muslim friend's home isn't the same because it hasn't been sacrificed to another god, just prepared in a ritualistic way. So what do Paul's words to the Corinthians have to do with Holy Trinity today? I'm so glad you asked. For Christians today and the Corinthians then, it's not about sacrificed meat, but sacred cows. For those of you who may not have ever heard that phrase, sacred cows are those traditions and mindsets that are hard to change. Churches and denominations go to war over sacred cows. The reason why we have 5+ Lutheran denominations in the U.S. is because of sacred cows. The issue for the Corinthians was sacred cows as well. The Old Testament says nothing about eating food sacrificed to idols. As I said earlier, there are some dietary restrictions, but none of these fall under the issue Paul's dealing with. You know, we talk about the 10 commandments, but for Jewish people, there are 613 commandments in the Hebrew scriptures. There's plenty about food, but none of them deal with food sacrificed to idols. What happened was that over the centuries, the Jewish leaders developed hedge laws, rules that weren't biblical but helped you make sure you didn't mess up any of those 613 commandments. The first 2 commandments tell us not to have any other gods before Yahweh, and we shouldn't make any carved images, that is, idols. The scribes and Pharisees took it a step further and said, just to be safe, don't even eat the meat sacrificed to an idol. It wasn't biblical, but it became a sacred cow for Jewish people. We have plenty of sacred cows in the church today. Last week I shared with you the story of why I wear my liturgically coordinated African attire. I was told I shouldn't say liturgically correct because liturgically correct would be the alb and the stole. You know, like whatever. Okay, so liturgically coordinated African attire. And if you missed that sermon last week, too bad. No. You'll just have to go online to listen to it there. A pastor wearing the traditional alb and stole combination is a sacred cow for many Lutherans. It was for me. At seminaries, Lutheran heritage class teaches pastors to be the symbolism of the alb, stole, and chasuble, while worship class teach you the proper way to wear them, along with the proper hand positions throughout worship. There are specific hand positions that you're supposed to have, like when you're doing communion, called the Orion position, whatever. I'm sorry. I have the knowledge as to why pastors wore them. I have the right as an ordained and rostered pastor in the ELCA to wear them, but none of it's biblical. My wearing it caused me to trip up a young man who was a very new believer, and therefore weak or immature in his faith, to the point that I don't know if he ever made it back to church. It took me a long time to get over that sacred cow. Another sacred cow for many Lutherans is communion. For some, it's how many times a month you have communion, but for most, it's what you eat at communion. For many folks, if you don't have wafers and wine, it's just wrong. In seminary, I took a class on 12-step programs and the church. For my final paper, I wrote why it was important for churches to be caring of those in recovery and offer juice alongside wine. It was a well thought out, biblically and theologically sound paper, and if I must say, one of my best. I got a B on the paper because the professor said I didn't understand Lutheran theology. You gotta remember, born and brainwashed Lutheran, okay, that's all I've ever known. But he said I didn't understand Lutheran theology. I tore up the paper and threw it away, but I still remember the sacred cow thinking that he wrote at the end of my paper. Wine is the only acceptable element for communion, he said. One little sip at communion will not harm the recovery of an alcoholic. If they feel that they can't drink the wine, it is sufficient for them to have communion in only one of the elements, the body. Remember, this was a class on 12-step programs and the church. I know, yeah, you're probably thinking, that's shocking. But what does that have to do with Holy Trinity? We have wine, juice, bread, wafers, and gluten-free wafers every Sunday for communion, or Saturday, sorry. And we're okay with what you wear. At least I think y'all are okay with what I wear. If you're not, well, you know. Well, those may not be your sacred cows, but you do have some. For some, and may not be so much with this service, but for some, Sunday school during worship is a sacred cow. I know there are folks who are upset about the changes that we're making with Sunday school. As I said, maybe not with y'all, but there's some Sunday morning people who are upset about it. I'm not going to go into details about the background of the change. You can read my extensive newsletter article if you want more info why. I will say that if there's ever a change that has 100% agreement, it's probably not a significant change. Another sacred cow at Holy Trinity is the music. Mark, who's not here tonight, so tell him. Be sure to tell him I tell you, he's a wonderful person on the piano. Beautiful voice when singing solos. I love that there are a variety of hymns sung at this service. Here's the thing. Most of the music that's sung or played here is geared towards older folks who've grown up in the church. If someone who walked in the door who hasn't grown up in the church, especially a Lutheran church, they might trip and fall because of the music. If you truly want younger people, including young families with children, you may need to sacrifice that sacred cow. That doesn't mean completely getting rid of those songs and hymns you love. It might mean instead of having a piano every week, there might occasionally be a keyboard or guitar. Or instead of having Mark playing the piano and singing a solo most Saturdays, once a month, maybe have a praise band in or a jazz trio. And some of you may have tuned me out by now since I'm talking about your sacred cows. But still, I have to give you one more sacred cow at just about every mainline Protestant church. Money. I don't mean the church's money. I mean your money. Most Christians have no problem with talking about the church's money, how much staff members make, and if it's really worth paying them that much, whether or not that ministry really needs a budget line, the size of the deficit, how to bring in more money. But Protestants, including Lutherans, don't want to talk about their personal money. So don't talk about tithing in the church. Don't talk about giving more. You'll hear all kinds of excuses when that happens. I'm on a fixed income. God loves a cheerful giver. Tithing is an Old Testament teaching. And my favorite, what I give is between me and God. I've got responses for all those excuses, but not enough time today to talk about them. So if you have any concern, if you use one of those excuses and you're like, wait a second, why can't I say that? I'd be glad to talk with you personally about it. And maybe I'll include in the sermon at another time, but not today. What I will say is this. Last week, Holy Trinity approved a budget that's about $22,000 short. And some folks are very worried about that. I'm not. Many churches have budgets that are short $50,000 to $100,000, and they do wonderful ministry every year. Most mega churches don't even have a balanced budget. So show me a church that has a balanced budget, and I'll show you a church that's not really doing ministry. A balanced budget at a church means you're relying totally on yourself and not on God. And here's the biggest thing for Holy Trinity. If every giving unit, and a giving unit means every family, whether that's a family of 1 or a family of 10, if every giving unit at Holy Trinity increased their giving by just $10 a month, that deficit would be wiped out. Just $10 a month. Just imagine what could be done in this place if every giving unit tithed. We just need to get rid of a few sacred cows. I know. You have a right to keep all the money you make. You have the right to sing only the songs you love. You have the right to Sunday school every Sunday during worship. Paul reminds us that even if we have the right, even if we have the wisdom to do what we believe to be right, we need to consider if our rights will trip newcomers, why can't I say that word? Newcomers to the faith. Take care, Paul says, that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. Instead of being hung up about our rights, instead of being overinflated by our knowledge, we need to focus on love. Rights and knowledge have caused churches to split, but I've never heard of a church splitting because of love. Asserting your knowledge and rights tears down. Love builds up. We need to love everyone, from other believers to those who have little use for Christianity. In love, we should never act in ways that should trip up anyone spiritually. We need to work hard on not leading a Christian brother or sister to sin. Before I finish, I need to be clear that I'm not talking about making sure everybody is happy. Too often, churches don't make changes because they're afraid of upsetting some people. I've probably made a few people unhappy today. That's all right. Paul wasn't talking about things which they merely don't like. He was talking about things that do spiritual harm to other believers. There's a big difference there. A church where no one is ever unhappy about something in the congregation is a church with no members. I was going to say with one member, but then I thought if there's just one member in the church, they're going to get unhappy about something as well. Sometimes it's appropriate to do something which makes another Christian unhappy. We should never do something which would encourage them to sin against God. Never. We need to make sure we're not tripping someone. We need to be willing to give up some things for the sake of others. In love, Paul was willing to give up his rights, limit his own freedom, and deny himself pleasure in order to make sure he didn't trip up other believers. Sisters and brothers, God calls each of us to do the same thing. Or as Paul puts it in his letter to the Philippians, we need to not look only at our own interests, but also to the interests of others with an attitude that's the same as that of Jesus Christ. That's a very high standard. But it is what God expects of God's children. I know it goes against the grain of our culture and against the dominant view within the church. It's a standard based on love that says the spiritual welfare of a brother or sister is more important than any rights we might want to exercise. Let me close with this. I know I'm not the world's greatest dad, but I do make quite a few sacrifices for the sake of my 3 children. There are things I give up having or doing so that my children can have and do some of what they desire. I know I can be a little selfish sometimes, but I make those sacrifices not only willingly, but gladly. I gladly give up my rights, freedom, and pleasure to help Dion, Maya, or Evan. Now I need to work on having that same attitude toward everyone else in this church. Just imagine if we all had that attitude toward each other. Through Jesus' death and resurrection, we've been adopted into God's family, which makes us all sisters and brothers. When we remember this, it helps us to willingly give up some things for the sake of others. It helps us to gladly sacrifice our sacred cows. There may be frustrations at times, but when we're family, we're able to overcome those frustrations. And out of love, we do what we can to build up and encourage each other rather than tripping believers. Amen.